Elijah. Elijah is the prophet we talked about a few weeks ago who went to that cave on Mount Sinai when Jezebel threatened his life. And you may remember at the end of that reading, Elijah, J-A-H, is told to return from where he came. He's to anoint, I forget the name, someone king of Syria, and Jehu is to be anointed king of Israel, which means that Jezebel and her husband Ahab's wicked ways are coming to an end. Also in that, Elijah is told to anoint Elisha to take his place. So Elisha is going to be Elijah's successor. And gold star to anyone who can tell me how Elijah left this world. The choir sings an old...
He didn't go up in a chariot.
Yes, he did. Gold star to Tom.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yep, so Elijah is taken to heaven in a chariot of fire. And the choir has sung a spiritual that I absolutely love called Ride the Chariot. I'm gonna ride in the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm gonna ride in the chariot in the morning, Lord. I'm getting ready for the judgment day, my Lord, my Lord. And because Elisha does not actually die, he's taken to heaven alive, he takes on a very important role in the Jewish faith. And in fact, the Hebrew scriptures, the prophet Malachi closes that section of the Bible out, and it ends with God saying, I will send my prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord, which means the coming of Messiah. So in Judaism, in order for someone to be the Messiah, Elijah has to come back. And when they celebrate the Passover, they put a glass on the table for Elijah. And they end the Seder meal with a statement, next year, Elijah will come. And so we are now at the point where Elijah has ascended to heaven. By the way, Christians can say that Jesus is the Messiah because where does Elijah appear in the Gospels?
He appears in the Transfiguration.
That's right. Elijah does come back. When Jesus is on the Mount of Transfiguration, he talks with Elijah and Moses. So we as people of faith can say that part of the Jewish faith has been fulfilled because Elijah did return. Okay. So without further ado, we're going to read this passage, or listen to this passage, and it has to do with an important Syrian general by the name of Naaman.
2 Kings 5. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. Now the Syrians on one of their raids had carried off a little girl from the land of Israel, and she worked in the service of Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, would that my Lord were with the prophet who is in Samaria. He would cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman went in and told his Lord. Thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel. And the king of Syria said, go now, and I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So he went, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 changes of clothes. And he brought the letter to the king of Israel, which read, when this letter reaches you, know that I have sent to you Naaman my servant, that you may cure him of his leprosy. And when the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, am I God, to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy? Only consider and see how he is seeking a quarrel with me. But when Elisha the man of God heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he sent to the king, saying, Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman came with his horses and chariots, and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, Behold, I thought he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in a rage. But his servants came near and said to him, My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, Wash and be clean? So he went down and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean.
All right. Questions, comments, and conundrums.
Why did they both get angry? Why did the king of Israel get angry? And why did Naaman get angry?
Okay, so 2 questions. Why did the king of Israel get angry, and why did Naaman get angry? Let's start with the first one. So the king of Israel gets this letter from the king of Syria saying to him, I'm sending to you my general Naaman. He has leprosy, and I want you to cure him.
So, were they on good terms, Israel and Syria?
Back then, nobody was on good terms with it anyway. It was very Machiavellian. And
So why would Syria then rely on Israel to help Naaman?
because Naaman has a servant girl from Israel who has said, there's a prophet in Israel who can heal you.
So he was desperate. He wanted to try to.
Yes. Leprosy was a dreaded disease back then. They didn't understand it. And we know today that it is caused actually by a virus, okay? And it attacks the nervous system. Gold star to anyone who can tell me the modern name for leprosy.
Eczema?
Nope. Eczema, good guess.
Shingles.
Shingles, you know, it's interesting. I think it's along the same genre of illness. It's actually a person's name, the person who discovered, I believe, the virus. It's actually known as Hansen's disease. Hansen's disease. And essentially why it was so dreaded is it kills the nerves, okay? So for example, a person with leprosy could be scrubbing floors and the water could be scalding hot and they wouldn't know it. So what would happen is they would end up, you know, particularly hands and feet and whatnot would get very disfigured because they would not realize that they were subjecting their body to pain. You know, you could, if you had Hansen's disease, you could be sweeping a floor and the handle could have a nail in it and you wouldn't know it. And so, you know, it was very common for a person after many years with leprosy to, you know, be fingers worn down to nubs and things like that. Yes, Tom.
Wasn't it I was thinking about why he went to the king.
Yes.
And wasn't it a very common belief in those days that the healing powers of a king, and that basically what you could cure yourself of quite a number of things by just touching the hem of the garment of a king.
There were some beliefs that if you were a king, you were anointed by God, so you had special powers. Right. But let's remember now, in this situation, the slave girl doesn't say, the king of Israel can heal you. She says, there is.
It's a prophet. It's a prophet. But it's interesting that the king of Syria wrote to the king. He didn't say, go and seek out this prophet. He said,
yes,
I'm sending you a letter of introduction to the king.
Exactly. So it is kind of little convoluted. Slave girl says to her master's wife, actually, does she say it to him directly or to his wife?
He says it to the wife.
Yes, says it to the wife. There's a prophet in Israel who can heal you. Naaman takes this information, goes to the king of Syria. The king of Syria then sends Naaman to the king of Israel, along with all of these treasures. So I think this is what's going on. If you're king of Syria and your general, who's brought you all these victories, goes to the king of Israel without telling you, what are you going to think?
What they up to.
And he's betraying me. Okay, so Naaman goes to the king of Syria just to say, hey, king, this is what's going on. I don't want you to be worried. And he's asking for permission. Okay, and the king of Syria grants it. And I think likewise, if Naaman just goes into Israel and goes directly to Elijah, what is the king of Israel going to think? Up to no good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why he goes to the king of Israel first. Now, the reason why the king of Israel, does it say his name?
I don't think so.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Yeah. So the reason why the king of Israel gets angry and upset is because he thinks that the king of Syria is trying to provoke a fight with him. He thinks that the king of Syria is saying to the king of Israel, you heal him. And that's why he says, am I God that I can do this?
He's seeking a quarrel.
That's right. And so what the king of Israel is afraid is he can't heal Naaman of his leprosy. Naaman is going to go back to the king of Syria. The king of Syria is going to say, well, let's attack him. So that's why the king of Israel is angry. Okay. He thinks that he's being set up. Okay. And then he's told, where is it? Oh, so Elisha realizes that this is going on. So Elisha sends message to the king of Israel and says, what are you getting all worried about? I can cure him of his leprosy. Send him to me. And the king of Israel says, phew, and off he goes. Now, your second question was, why does Naaman get angry?
He just got help. But I think it's because Elijah did not come out to greet him. It was a messenger. And he was put off that, what, am I not good enough to be seen by the main man?
Yep. So I think you get a gold star, Andy, because it says in verse 9, so Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. Obviously, this is a big shot here. He's got chariots and horses and all of that. And Elisha doesn't even go out. That's sort of disrespectful, particularly back then when rank was very important. And so Naaman is insulted. And he's full of himself because what does he say? He says, I thought he would have come out and called upon his God and made a big to-do about it. And instead he says, go wash in the Jordan River. That little
That's it.
puddle, and there are rivers in Damascus and Syria that are 10 times better than that. So he's full of himself. Okay. And that's why he's angry. And then his servants say to him, and interesting, how a lot of this story is being moved by the lowly people. The servant girl who tells her mistress that there's a prophet in Israel. Okay. Elisha's servant who goes out and says, this is what you're supposed to do. Naaman's servant who says, he's not asking you to do something really difficult. You come all this way, you might as well do it. And he does, and he's healed.
So there's a corruption in the judgment of people who end up rising in the hierarchy.
Oh,
of
interesting.
society.
So
There's-
you're making the case that as you get higher up the rung of the ladder, of success, that it can twist and blind you in some respects.
Right. Whereas poorer people or the lower levels.
The poor people have a better insight. Yep. And same thing with children.
There's a message there somewhere.
Oh, there is definitely a message. Yes, exactly. So it's a fascinating story. And one of the questions that I have is, why doesn't God do it the way Naaman wants it? In other words, this story could have taken a whole different trajectory. Okay, so Naaman gets there and Elisha comes out and he does what he thinks and calls upon the God. There's a clap of lightning, a voice from the heavens speaks, and then, there's a whirlwind or something, and when the dust clears, Naaman is healed. Why does it happen this way instead of the other way?
It doesn't work that way when requiring like faith.
So it needs faith. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And what is keeping Naaman from having faith?
His position in life.
Say again?
His position in life.
His position in life. Yeah. He's full of himself.
Right.
He's full of himself. And
I have a question. Did at that time, did poor people go bathe in the river, but a rich person had a bath?
oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, Leslie.
He's I'm not going to go bathe in a river. I'm not the rich.
Okay, so people who were poor, the only way they could wash up was going down to the river. But if you were rich, you had whatever they used for tubs back then. You had servants come and pour the water in there. You didn't have to go down and mingle with the commoners. So
It was like a humility thing.
yes,
Humble himself.
yep, exactly. Yes, Jim.
In verse 10.
10.
Verse 7, why 7?
7 times. Why 7? So
King 7 kingdom.
So 7 is known as a perfect number. It had great significance in ancient times. It's an ordinal number. It can only be divided by itself and the number 1. And just as 666 is known as the devil's number, 777 is considered to be the Holy Trinity number. It's either he would have been told to wash 3 times or 7 times. You'll notice a lot of times in biblical stories, something will happen 3 times.
Yeah.
And it's a storytelling device that is saying to the listener, pay attention because God's going to do something here. And so he would have either been told, I think, to wash 3 times or 7 times. Now, maybe it's 7 times because he is so full of himself. Yeah.
3 won't do it.
Yeah.
See if maybe. So let me ask you this question: do you think it's a test?
See if he's willing to do it 7 times.
Yeah. Does God test you?
So,
You think we do? Yep.
I think you do. Yeah, Elijah was saying, well, I'll come to do it 3 times. No, I better make it 7.
Yes. And we could have made it 3 times and made it easy for Elijah, but he makes it double plus 1. And I do believe that God does test us sometimes. Now, it isn't like God is up there saying, okay, I'm going to send a little plague or this or that. I think that God lets things happen that put us to the test. And in that situation, when we find ourselves being put to the test, the question is, where do we turn? Okay, do we turn to ourselves or false leaders or prophets or whatever, or do we turn to God? And So yeah, the other way I look at this is sometimes God has to break us before God can make us.
Boot camp.
Boot camp. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. Divine boot camp. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, sometimes God has to knock you down a few pegs. And maybe that God's way of doing that is to let your whatever, your pride or your selfishness or whatever is getting in the way between you and God's grace to get you into trouble. And because it's only when you hit bottom, so to speak, spiritually, that it opens the door for God to
Raise you up.
and to get through to you. I would much rather have somebody come to my office in the middle of a problem than not in the middle of a problem, because the incentive to work and to change and to make the difficult decisions are much greater. So yeah, I can think of another example of God breaking someone to making them before making them. And that person is in the Christian scriptures, in the book of Acts. Paul, exactly. Very good, Paul. Yeah. So how did God break Paul, or the Lord break Paul before he could make him the greatest of all the apostles?
He knocked him from his horse and blinded.
He blinded him. That's right. Very good, Jane. Jane gets a gold star today too. Thank you. Absolutely. So think about it. Paul is on the road to Damascus. He's full of himself. He is an important person. He has been given official papers to go to Damascus, find people of the way, and drag them back to Jerusalem to face a reckoning for their heretical beliefs. He's on this road. There's a flash of light. He hears a voice say, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" And just so that we're clear, Saul would have been the Roman name Saul was the Jewish name. Paul would have been his Roman name. And he's blinded. Now, think about it. If you're blinded, doesn't it make you dependent? Particularly if you've lived your whole life with sight and suddenly you don't have your sight anymore. And it isn't like Paul is blinded in his own home.
I was just going to say that. He's like on a journey.
Yes, he's far away from home. Exactly. He's out in the middle of nowhere, which also makes him vulnerable, because think about it. If I'm in Paul's situation and there's a flash of light and a voice is speaking and I can't see, one of the things I'm afraid of is all the people who are with me, who can help me, are going to flee. They're going to run from their lives.
Yeah.
And here I am out in the middle of the desert. It's got to be petrifying for him.
And he didn't have a AAA card.
He did not have a AAA card. Akbar, the camel driver, didn't make, it was beyond the 3-mile limit for AAA. So, Paul is incredibly vulnerable. And he goes into the city and he's told to wait there. And God speaks to a Christian by the name of Ananias. And Ananias is told to go and heal Paul. We're told that Ananias, and think about how difficult that must have been for Ananias. He knows who Paul is. He knows that Paul is there to drag him back and potentially throw him in prison. But he goes and he walks into the room where Paul is, and he says to them, "Brother Paul." He doesn't say, "Hey, Paul, let's get this over with. I got to do this whether I like it or not." He goes in and he says, "Brother Paul." He's making a connection. And he places his hands on Paul's eyes, and something falls off of his eyes. Like what? What is it? Scales. That's right, scales. Yep. And Paul can see again. So talk about how humiliating. Paul's life is rescued, so to speak, by the very person or one of the very people that he came to drag back to Jerusalem. So I look at this whole story and I see God or the Lord breaking Paul to make him. And I see the same thing here in Naaman's encounter. Elisha is breaking him of his arrogance. And, you know, sometimes the journey of faith, we have to stop and say to ourselves, what is it that God needs to break in me in order to make me? Do we like to think about that kind of God? No. No.
Other people with that accent.
Yeah, other people. Yeah. So God, break that person over there because he's making my life miserable. Why is everyone picking on me? Who said that?
Charlie Brown.
No. There's a song.
Yeah,
Why is
Charlie Brown.
everyone picking on me?
Charlie Brown. He's a clown. Why is everybody always picking on me?
Oh, is that?
Yeah, it's from Smokey Joe's Cafe.
Oh, okay. I knew there was.
I know that because I just saw it last week.
Oh, funny. I knew there was some. Why is everyone always picking on me? Yeah, and you know, yes, we can.
Bible passage that's in there.
So, you know, I look back over my life and the times where I've had it really the most difficult. It's very easy to say, okay, Lord, you know, the problem is over there, fix that person or whatnot. And I shared this story in a sermon a few months ago. I'll never forget when I was in my second year of seminary, I was a student minister at a little Methodist church and very unhealthy. I can now look back on it and realize that the lay leaders, and small Methodist church particularly, they have lay leaders. We call them moderators or whatnot. The lay leader, one of them was, I now realize, a paranoid schizophrenic. The other one, she was just a bully. Big, heavy-set woman. And in fact, I can remember when we had all kinds of problems in this church. And I had a dream. And in the dream, this woman from the church came up to me and she says, I bet that you think that because I'm a woman, I won't slug you. And before I could say anything, she said, well, you're wrong. Boom. And I woke up from that dream and I said, oh, okay, I've got to be as wise as a serpent here. And so at the time I was taking a class in seminary. I don't even remember what the class was all about, but I had to present a case study from something going on in the church where I was doing my field ed. And so I presented this case study and how this woman was just making my life miserable. All of my classmates were showering me with sympathy, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, she's a clergy killer. You got to watch out for her." And you know, oh, how could anybody be that mean-spirited? And so after they had showered me with sympathy,
yeah, that's not what you needed, though.
You're right. That's not what I needed. Now, it may have been true. She may have been a clergy killer. But what I needed is what the professor said. So after I got all of this sympathy and everything was kind of winding down, he looked at me and he said, this woman knows you pretty good, doesn't she? And I went, ow. And as I reflected on it, and I forget exactly what it was that he was pointing out, but similar to what we're talking about, it would have been very easy to say, fix her, God, fix him. And I needed to look at myself and what I needed broken in me in order for God's grace to go to work. And in fact, it did break me. And I'm funny, I'm just making this connection here. And I've known these two dots on my life journey, so to speak, but I just connected them with this class. And because of this experience that I had in this church, I almost dropped out of seminary. I was actually seriously considering dropping out of seminary. And the reason why I say that is because I can remember there was this meeting, and the way this worked is there were 3 little Methodist churches and 1 supervising pastor, ordained Methodist minister, who would go from week to week between the different churches. And so as a student minister, it was great because you led the services twice out of every 3 weeks, and you got to experience a lot of things that you wouldn't have otherwise. And we were at this meeting of their administrative board. The lay leader, the one who was the paranoid schizophrenic, didn't show up. He was angry about something. And then all of a sudden he came bursting in to the meeting, and he came over to the table. I was sitting on the other side, and I can still remember it to this day. And he was literally jabbing his finger at me and saying, you, this is all your fault. Everything was fine until you got here. And then he stormed out. And the supervising pastor, as soon as he left, said, I'm sorry, people, but this church cannot continue to be a teaching parish. It's just not healthy enough, because nobody would stand up to these 2 individuals. And thankfully, this was in May, so it wasn't that long, or end of April, so it wasn't that long until the year was going to be over. But after that, I remember thinking to myself, I didn't go to seminary for this. And all of a sudden, this voice said to me, well, why did you go to seminary? And that moment forced me to come face to face with some brokenness in my past that I had to come to terms with. And I thought, oh, you're going to seminary all for the wrong reason. If you're going to seminary for the affirmation and blah blah blah, then no, your call is not legitimate. You need to leave. And I seriously thought about it. Fortunately, the field ed program had individuals in place that helped me work through it. And I realized, okay, my call isn't legitimate, but God is calling me to look at myself so that I can bring healing, so that I'm doing it for the right reasons. And it's one of the reasons why I always say, well, sometimes at ecclesiastical council, in our tradition, the last step before you are ordained is an ecclesiastical council. And what will happen is the person who is in the ordination process will read their ordination paper to ministers and lay delegates from churches in your association. And then they ask questions, and then the person leaves, and then they vote on whether to approve the person for ordination pending an ordainable call. Sometimes during those ecclesiastical councils, I will ask this question. Could you tell me a little bit about the selfish dimension to your call to ministry? Because anyone who says, I'm doing it for the glory of God and the good of humanity, end of story, is either not being honest with themselves or they're not being honest with you. They're either blind or not. Because I believe that Henry Naaman wrote a book called The Wounded Healer. And he said that God uses our brokenness to bring grace into the world. And so I look at Naaman here, and You know? Yep. God through Elisha, God through the servant girl in Syria, God through Naaman's own servants are all working together to break him. And here's a question. So Naaman goes down and he washes 7 times, not once, not 3 times, but 7 times in the Jordan River. And he comes out and his skin, how does it describe it?
Restored like that of a child.
Restored like the flesh of a little child. You know, what's the saying? Soft as a baby's bottom. So what do you think is going through Naaman's mind as he comes out of the Jordan River and he returns home to Damascus?
Well, these peons were right.
Yeah, these peons were right. Yeah. Do you think he's going back a changed man? You know, we can't say for certain, but everything would seem to suggest that he's going back to Damascus a different man, not just physically, because he no longer has leprosy, but spiritually and emotionally. If I'm Naaman, I'm saying to myself, you know what? I need to make sure that I'm not so high on my horse, high on my chariot, so to speak, that I don't listen to those servants, because they may know something that I don't know. So in this story, we get a different God. We get a God who sometimes is going to be tough with us. And the question is, do we have room in our faith for that tough God? What do you think? Do we hope so? Yeah. Hope so. Yeah.
What's harder?
What's that? Yeah.
Because when you're up against a wall,
Mm-hmm.
you have to, God can come in and say, this wall, this has got to go.
Yep. This wall has got to go. Yep. And because what's his name? Robert Frost. You know, mending walls, and he says something to the effect, before I build a wall, I'd like to know what I was walling in and walling out. And, you know, yeah, you build those walls and you can make yourself a prisoner. This is sort of like I said a few weeks ago about our comfort zones. If we're not careful, our comfort zone can become a prison. And, you know, the God that we worship builds bridges, but also knocks down walls. And, but
You do sadly see sometimes when something bad happens to somebody, they turn away from God.
they turn away from God.
So in that case, I'd say they didn't have room in faith for that, you know?
Yeah,
They
yeah.
blame,
They blame God.
for a
Yeah,
young
yeah.
person dying
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
something like that.
So
Because
this,
there are people who get broken and they remain broken
they remain broken.
because it's too hard to make yourself.
It's too hard to remake themselves. But here's the thing. God's grace is always there to remake us. So it's up to us to decide whether we're going to stay broken. And, you know, sometimes people stay broken because they want the sympathy. You know, it's a lot easier. Oh, what was this? Oh, it's some story about a little kid and he's crying on the playground and he's faking it. And some little kid says, you know, he says, yeah, I know that, but the teachers don't know that. So the teachers were all giving him sympathy and he was, you know, milking it, you know. Yeah, look, being a person of faith isn't easy. It involves hard work sometimes. And, you know, one of the things that I see sometimes is somebody comes into a church, they're new, and they sit down, and there's this attitude, oh, I'm here now. Everything is going to be perfect. No, you can still go out and still find a flat tire on your car. Okay? So God doesn't break us without always being there to remake us. And as you were talking, Andy, it surprises people to know that the state of Israel is a very secular state. Yep. People think, oh, it's a Jewish state, it's going to be very religious. It is not. The vast majority of people in Israel are what they call cultural Jews. They are not religious Jews. And do you know the reason why the vast majority are cultural Jews as opposed to religious Jews?
They fit in better.
Pardon me?
They fit in better.
They fit in better because it is predominantly,
Accepted.
yeah. Although the Sabbath laws are enforced. If you go to Israel and you are in a hotel, say you're on the 16th floor, better be prepared because the elevator is going to stop at every floor because you cannot push an elevator button. That's work. So they program it. And that's just one thing. Nothing is open in Israel. Not supermarkets, anything. The reason why is because Israel has like 30 different political parties, and there are 3 or 4 small religious parties, and they'll go with whoever as long as the majority in power agrees to continue the religious Sabbath laws. And a lot of the secular Jews resent it. Now, the reason why Israel is primarily secular, Holocaust. The Holocaust. So many Jews turned away from God because of the Holocaust. How could God let this happen? And so that's where the seeds for secular Judaism came from. I look at it and I understand it, but I also say, look, God may have let it happen, but what do you want? God to micromanage everything in your life so nothing bad happens? I mean, I always say that if you got to be careful when you say, well, why did God let this happen? Because behind that, you're saying, if God really loved us, God wouldn't let this happen. So what that means is you don't get any free choice anymore. Okay? So, this person loves that person. God says, nope, sorry, you can't be together because you both have a gene. And if you both pass that gene on to your child, the child is going to be born with cystic fibrosis. So I know you love each other, but sorry, you can't get married. Or, boy, I'm looking forward to that second piece of chocolate cake. Nope, God says you can't have it. It's going to clog up your arteries with cholesterol and you'll have a heart attack and you'll come and blame me. This is the package deal when it comes to free choice. So, any other thoughts, questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
It's not really relevant to what we're talking about.
That's okay.
If Naaman was a leper,
Yeah.
why did he have such a position as a commander of the army?
How did he end up as good question. So, how did Naaman end up being a commander of the Syrian army if he was a leper? And
They say there were different degrees of leprosy.
yeah, so my guess.
Minor skin ailment that he had or something?
Yep. So my guess is that Naaman contracted leprosy long after he was a general,
Right.
and that the disease had not progressed significantly. Okay. And this is one of the things, people didn't know how you got leprosy. And so this is why lepers were excluded. Now, a good question, Jane, is how was he able to continue to be a general if he was a leper? because once you got leprosy, you were shunned. And so my guess is that this had just recently happened, and Naaman is desperate because he knows that if he isn't cured of his leprosy, his position of privilege is gone. And so he's desperate.
If I remember correctly, historically, the king of Jerusalem during the Crusades acquired leprosy
It wouldn't surprise me.
and continued to rule until his death.
Mhm.
But
He would have been in seclusion.
But did so at a distance from all his.
Yeah. So if you were a leper, and if you look at the gospel stories, there are stories of lepers, and they always were calling to Jesus from afar. Okay? Because if they came over, they could have been stoned to death.
Mhm.
And if you were a leper and somebody came to you, you had to cover your lip and holler, unclean, unclean.
Or I think if they were during the Middle Ages, they were required to have a bell.
A bell or something,
You know, so
in the
that
Middle Ages.
People would be more.
It was a terrible disease it's sort of like how people in this country reacted to polio.
Or, I was gonna say,
Yeah, AIDS when it first came out. Yeah, I remember people wouldn't touch them, or even COVID to a certain degree. I can remember going and visiting someone whose mother had died of COVID, and she came out, and I found out that she had COVID too. And I'm standing probably half the distance between us, and I'm thinking to myself, how can I get out of here really quick? So, yeah, but I do believe sometimes God has to break us before God can make us. And it ain't fun, but it always leads to grace. All righty, everyone. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.